It's the end of October 2010, and some important government announcements on defence and finance have just been made. Can you lead us through what has happened and why it's important, please, Peter?
Well, the government has published its national security strategy. It's also released the results of its strategic defence and security review, and we've also had publication of a comprehensive spending review, which outlines the government's spending programme for the next 4 years. When it first came to power, the coalition government announced that it would be undertaking a fundamental review of security and defence matters, and we're seeing the results of that review being published now. The comprehensive spending review is something that takes place on most years. Only this year it's particularly important because it outlines the programme of spending cuts that the government intends to make in order to reduce Britain's budget deficit and bring the economy back on track again.
Let's start with the spending review, because the money available limits what governments can do, doesn't it?
That's correct. And this year we will see spending cut back to a level which is said to be the deepest in terms of cuts since World War II. George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, has announced that on average government departments will be facing cuts of 19% in their budgets. And some departments will be facing even deeper cuts than that. The Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, for example, is facing a cut of 29% in its budget, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is being cut by 24%. Now, when you compare that with the cuts in the Ministry of Defence, which are only 7.5%, then it's become apparent that despite some of the whining that we heard from generals and newspaper editors, Defence has actually done very well out of this review and has been spared from the worst of the cuts. When David Cameron announced the results of the Defence Review in Parliament, he stressed that even after the cuts, the UK would still have the 4th largest military budget in the world.
So what's the government's current strategy on defence and security issues?
Well, this is outlined in the National Security Strategy, and there are 2 elements to it. The first part of the strategy is for the UK to continue to remain an important global player, punching above its weight internationally, as politicians like to say. And it will do this by staying a first-rate military power and, of course, aligning its political and military forces alongside of the USA. So a lot of the national security strategy is about maintaining military forces at a level which is still credible and still seen as serious by the Americans. But there's a bit of a disconnect between this and the second element of the strategy, which is keeping the UK secure and resilient and protecting it from any risks and threats that it might face. And the National Security Strategy has outlined 15 serious threats that it thinks the UK faces. And these are grouped into different tiers. In the top tier of most serious threats, there are 4 threats. The threat of a significant terrorist attack, the risk of a cyber attack, the threats from a natural event such as serious coastal flooding or maybe an influenza pandemic, and finally the risk of the UK becoming involved in a serious international military conflict. Now, if you look at these 15 risks, then very few of them are actually the kind of risk that could be responded to through a military response. They require different types of approach to deal with them. So there's a mismatch between the pro-US military approach and what is really needed to deal with much of what's in the strategy. And that mismatch, I think, is best highlighted when you look at the programme to replace Trident nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons bear virtually no relevance at all to most of the threats in the National Security Strategy. They're barely mentioned in the text of the strategy at all. Yet, plans to replace Trident will consume a large part of the military budget over years to come.
And where does the Strategic Defence and Security Review fit in with all of this?
Well, the Strategic Defence and Security Review outlines the tasks that the government will take to meet the strategy that is outlined in the National Security Strategy. And a large part of that is about reviewing and reforming what the military does. The review starts off by saying that the government is treating the war in Afghanistan as its top priority. It's fully committed to that war, and there will be absolutely no cut in the budget for Afghanistan. But it does go on to outline some reforms that will be taken to the Ministry of Defence. There will be cuts in some of the expensive heavy metal equipment programmes that the MOD has formerly had. There will be reductions in the numbers of armed forces personnel. There will be some bases closed in the UK and overseas. And this is part of a process of reforming the military so that it's more responsive to the kinds of conflict that it's likely to have to deal with in the future. The emphasis for the military is on intelligence gathering, surveillance, special operations. The broader emphasis is on the use of what we sometimes call soft power to tackle problems and nip them in the bud before they become the kind of problems where a military response is needed.
Okay. A moment ago you mentioned Trident. There's a whole chapter in the Strategic Defence and Security Review relating to nuclear weapons. What does it say?
Well, the Defence Review says that the government is committed to keeping nuclear weapons and replacing Trident, but despite that, there's some interesting stuff in there. It says that the main decision for replacing Trident nuclear weapons doesn't now need to be taken until after the next election, and that the life of the Vanguard class submarines that carry Trident nuclear weapons can be extended until 2028. It also says that the submarines don't need to carry as many missiles as they have in the past. The new submarines will only have 8 nuclear missile launch tubes, and the current submarines would only have 8 tubes operationally available to them. In terms of nuclear warheads, there's some interesting stuff there as well. The government has said that it won't need to replace the current Trident nuclear warheads until at least 2030. That's a long way in the future, and so no decision on replacing the warheads will be needed during this Parliament. In terms of the current warhead arsenal, it's said that it's going to reduce the size of that. The stockpile will go down from round about 225 to no more than 180. That's a cut of around about 20%, and there'll be similar cuts in terms of the operationally deployed warheads. That will go down from no more than 160 to no more than 120, and also in terms of the warheads on board each submarine, no more than 48 down to no more than 40. The government has also talked about the terms under which it might be tempted to use nuclear weapons, and it's declared a policy that it won't use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against any country which has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and which is in compliance with its obligations under that treaty.
So all this sounds like pretty good news.
I think it is good news, and it will allow the United Kingdom to say that it's keeping the promises it made earlier this year at the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in New York, when it promised to downplay the role of nuclear weapons in its defence. However, there are some caveats, some things that we need to watch out for here. Firstly, we don't know what the timetable for any of these reforms are. We don't know when the warheads will be brought out of service. It may not be until the 2020s. Secondly, although the government has said that there's no immediate need to replace nuclear weapons, the atomic weapons establishment, where the warheads will be built at, the building and infrastructure development programme there is still going ahead at full speed, with over £1 billion a year being spent every year at Aldermaston. Finally, although we're seeing some changes in the cost profile to the Trident replacement programme, by and large they aren't representing significant cuts in costs. It's just that the costs are being reprofiled over a broader period.
Okay, could you tell us more about this cost issue?
Well, the government has said that it can find perhaps £1.2 billion in savings over the length of the Trident replacement programme. It can also spread an extra £2 billion of costs over a longer time scale. However, It's also said that the overall costs of replacing the submarines, the infrastructure, the warheads is pretty much in line with the original estimate that it gave back in 2007 of £20 billion. Now that figure needs to be taken with a big pinch of salt because it doesn't represent the operating costs of replacing Trident. It's not a true whole life figure for the cost of replacing Trident. Also, back in 2007, when the government was planning to decide to replace Trident, civil servants and admirals at the Ministry of Defence went out of their way to tell the House of Commons Defence Committee that there was no way the decision on replacing Trident could be deferred. It was a very tight timescale. The submarines were coming to the end of their lives could not possibly be extended. Now, of course, we see that that wasn't true, and that the life of the submarines can be extended. So everything that campaign groups said at the time, that that decision was not needed then, was perfectly correct. So I think that we are entitled to take anything that the Ministry of Defence says about programme timetables and costs with a degree of scepticism.
Is there anything more to look forward to?
Well, one of the things I think that the UK government really needs to think about doing in order to move towards its goal of a world without nuclear weapons is taking its nuclear weapons off a high state of alert. And that means moving back from a situation where UK nuclear weapons are constantly deployed at sea on a nuclear submarine. Now, we know that there have been discussions between the British government and the French government about this, and about the possibility of sharing submarine patrols alternatively between a UK submarine and a French submarine. That's something which may be coming up for discussion in November, when the French government and the UK government hold a joint summit together. Whether or not anything comes out of that summit, it's still certainly an issue that should be very important for those of us campaigning against nuclear weapons. One of our key campaigning demands for the future must be the demand that Trident submarines are bought off from continuous nuclear patrol at sea.
Peter Betts, thank you very much.
Thank you.